Well, he looked at the literature and was aware of the growing concerns that we do not have enough information, nor do we have enough time to be sure that cell phones are safe. And there's reason for concern that they may be harmful, so we need to take some precaution rather than waiting to experiment on the rest of us.
So Dr. Black, meaning if they are harmful, we don't know why they're harmful, right?
Well, we know that microwave radiation can damage cells, and there's been some experimental evidence to suggest that there are harmful effects. But as Dr. Davis said, at this point in looking at the relationship between cell phone use and brain cancer, we have conflicting studies. Some studies, which are not absolutely perfect, show no correlation, and we also have some studies that tend to suggest a correlation. One of the recent studies from Sweden show that if you use cell phones for a period of 10 years, an hour a day, that your risk may be increased as much as twofold. The real concern here, Larry, is analogous to this. We've only been using cell phones for a short period. Most of the studies are for a short period of time. So if you have a 14-year-old who smokes cigarettes, we don't expect that 14-year-old to develop lung cancer at 24. We expect them to develop lung cancer at 54. If you have an 8-year-old using a cell phone, we don't expect them to develop lung cancer at 18, but at 48. So what happens after 20, 30, 40 years of use? That's the concern, and we don't have the answer yet to that.
If we have millions of cell phones in use now, right?
That's correct. And
has there been an increase in brain cancer?
Well, again, we know that if you look at studies, there have been various explanations to try to account for the increase in brain cancer. But
has there been an increase?
It's been an increased reported incidence, and that may be related to better MRI scans or more frequent use of CT scans. But we don't expect to, at this early stage, I mean, we've only been using cell phones with a high frequency for less than 10 years, for about 10, 20 years. So again, you know, the concern, and based on the biology that we know with the development of cancer, the real concern is what happens after 20, 30, 40 years. And that is what we need to be concerned about. And that's why I think the University of Pittsburgh advised us to be cautious.
The evidence, Dr. Song, having done so many interviews over the years against tobacco, was statistical. It wasn't, they didn't know why tobacco caused lung cancer, only that it caused lung cancer. You use tobacco, you got an increased chance. Is that going to be the evidence here, statistical?
It could be, but it may be another 10 or 20 years before we have the necessary statistics to make those recommendations. What we do know from radiation studies, whether or not it was people exposed in Hiroshima to kids treated for cancer with radiation, is that sometimes it took 15 to 20 years before people developed cancer that secondary that we could attribute to the radiation. When we talk about cell phones, we're looking at radio frequency, which is on the big spectrum of electromagnetic radiation. You've got radio waves on one side, which is responsible for TV, radio, and cell phones, and then you've got gamma waves on the other side. What we know about the gamma waves, or the more intense radiation, is that's a ionizing radiation that causes DNA damage that mutates cells that develop into cancer. For the radio waves, there has been no clear evidence to suggest that it's a DNA damage. So if there is some damage, it has to be some other mechanism that has really yet to be reported.
So what would you say to people who use cell phones?
I think the most important thing is that when we look at any type of radiation exposure, whether or not it's radio waves or gamma waves, is that the duration of your exposure. So clearly, if you're on the cell phone for a long period of time, I think we all have been in situations where our ear gets warm. That clearly means that maybe we're on a little bit too long.
So do what?
I think that an earpiece may help to greatly reduce the exposure for radio frequency radiation, but people need to keep in mind that if the phone is on the hip pocket, their whole body is still being exposed to the same amount of radiation that it would be if it was up to their ear. It's just that their brain...
What choice of cancer do I want, hip or brain?
Well, surprisingly, the concern about radio frequency exposure is not so much for the brain or the hip, but really either the testes or the eyes. Those are the areas that are most sensitive to radio frequency because they get hot and they don't have the blood vessels to cool off.
Would you say, Dr. Davis, therefore, always use an earpiece? Don't put a cell phone up to your ear?
If at all possible, use an earpiece, because it does reduce substantially the signal, because the further away you can have the phone from your body, the better off it is for you.
What about 8 and 9, 10-year-olds all over elementary school running around with them now?
Well, right now, unfortunately, of the 28 million children in this country who between the ages of 8 and 12, about half of them are using a cell phone. Sometimes it's their mom and dad's, but using it frequently. And we're all very concerned about that because we know that the cell signal gets deeply into the brain of a child.
You concerned, Dr. Black, about the child?
Yes, I am. We know that young brains may be more susceptible, and they have a longer exposure. And some of the studies have also suggested that the longer exposure, the higher the risk. I think that the key thing here, Larry, is that we would assume as a society that cell phones are safe, that the government wouldn't allow us to use this device unless it was safe. The reality is it's a source of microwave radiation. There have been studies to suggest that there may be an associated risk of brain cancer and also a benign tumor of the ear, and there have been some studies to suggest eye tumors as well. The important thing, I think, for your listeners to hear is that they need to be cautious because we may not have the answer to this for another 10 years.
Another distinguished